Some folks say evil is a choice, a slow turn down a dark road. But out in the New Mexico territories in the summer of 1893, evil wasn't a road. It was the air you breathed. It was the sun that beat down on the cracked earth. It was a sickness that got into the hearts of men and festered, turning them into monsters. And in this land of dust and forgotten gods, a quiet man named Thomas Graves was about to come face to face with the worst of it. He wasn't a hero, not anymore. He was just a man heading home from town, his horse loaded with salt blocks and bullets, the simple currency of survival. He liked the quiet. He craved the solitude of his remote ranch, a place where the ghosts of his past couldn't follow, or so he thought. As he guided his horse down a narrow canyon trail, a splash of wrongness caught his eye. Under a gnarled juniper tree, something lay huddled. At first he thought it was a discarded pile of rags, maybe a dead coyote. But then he saw the pale curve of a human shoulder. He pulled his horse to a halt. The silence of the canyon suddenly felt heavy, watchful. He dismounted, his hand resting on the worn grip of the pistol at his hip. He'd seen enough death in his life to know it had a certain stillness. This was different. This felt like a scream trapped in glass. He stepped closer. It was a girl. Couldn't be more than 20. Her dress was torn, her skin a road map of bruises and scratches. Her hair was matted with dried blood and dirt. She was wrapped in a filthy blanket, shivering despite the oppressive heat. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were open, staring, but they weren't seeing him. They were looking straight through the world, fixed on some private hell only she could see. There was no fear in them, no hope, nothing. The emptiness was more terrifying than any wound. He knelt down, careful not to startle her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raspy from the dust. She didn't flinch. Her lips, cracked and bleeding, parted. A voice like grinding stones whispered a single sentence that would haunt him for the rest of his days. "I'm filthy inside and out." Thomas froze. He'd been a U.S. Marshal for 10 years. He'd seen the aftermath of raids, the bodies left by bandits, the hollowed-out look of folks who'd lost everything. He knew what men were capable of when they thought no one was watching. Her words, her body, they told a story he didn't need to hear aloud. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what happened. Questions were a luxury, and she was fresh out of them. He stood up, took off his own dusty coat, and laid it gently over the tattered blanket. Then, with a strength that belied his years, he scooped her into his arms. She was light as a bundle of sticks. She didn't fight him, didn't make a sound. She just let her head fall against his chest, a silent surrender. It felt like she'd been running for 100 years and had finally been given permission to stop. As he carried her to his horse, the sun beat down on them both. He was a man who had buried his wife and his badge, seeking to lose himself in the wilderness. She was a girl who had lost even more. He didn't know it then, but by lifting her from the dust, he hadn't just saved her. He had signed his own death warrant. Because the evil she was running from wasn't just a man. It was an entire county, and it was already hunting for its missing property. The ride back to his ranch was a silent one. He put her in the saddle and walked beside the horse, one hand steadying her, the other never far from his gun. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her body trembling with a fever that had nothing to do with the heat. His ranch was little more than a one-room cabin and a leaning barn, tucked away in a small valley where the world couldn't easily find him. It was a fortress of solitude. Today it would become a sanctuary. He laid her down on his own cot, the only soft place in the entire cabin. He worked with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long practice. He heated water on the stove. He found the cleanest rags he owned. He set out a simple linen dress that had belonged to his late wife, Sarah. It felt like a violation of a memory, but survival had no room for sentiment. He placed the basin of warm water and the dress on a small table beside the cot. Then he turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. He gave her the one thing no one else had, a choice and privacy. He sat on his porch, rolling a cigarette with steady hands as the sky bled from orange to deep purple. He listened. He expected to hear sobbing, maybe the sound of something breaking. He heard nothing but the wind whistling through the cracks in his barn. He waited. An hour passed, then another. He lit a second cigarette. The tiny orange glow, a lonely star in the vast darkness. He wasn't a patient man by nature, but he'd learned the hard way that some things can't be rushed. Healing was one of them. Justice was another. Finally, the cabin door creaked open. She stood in the doorway, wearing his wife's dress. It hung loose on her skeletal frame, but it was clean. Her hair was wet and combed, hanging dark against her pale skin. She had washed away the blood in the dirt, but he could still see the bruises, stark and ugly against her neck and arms. She didn't look at him. She just stood there, clutching the doorframe, like she was afraid the night would swallow her whole. "There's stew on the stove," he said, not looking at her either. He kept his eyes on the horizon. "Eat." She didn't move. He heard a tiny choke sound. "What's your name, girl?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. A long silence stretched between them. He thought she wouldn't answer. Then her voice, barely a whisper, floated across the porch. "Ida." "Thomas," he replied, and that was it. Names exchanged in the dark. A fragile truce with the world. He pointed with his chin toward a small stool near the wall. "Sit or don't. Your choice." She hesitated. Then slowly, stiffly, she moved to the stool and sat, wrapping her arms around her knees. They sat like that for a long time. Two strangers sharing a silence. The vast, empty landscape their only witness. He thought maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of peace. He was dead wrong. Because miles away, in a smoke-filled saloon in the town of Abiquiu, a man with a red, bloated face was slamming his fist on a bar. He was telling anyone who would listen that his property had been stolen. And his very powerful brother, the man who owned the law in this county, had just put a bounty on the girl named Ida. A bounty that said dead or alive, but strongly preferred the former. The hunt had already begun. For 3 days, a strange routine settled over the ranch. Thomas went about his chores, mending fences, chopping wood, tending to his horse. Ida stayed close to the cabin. She never spoke unless spoken to, and her movements were as quiet and furtive as a field mouse. But he saw the changes. Small things. She started helping, sweeping the cabin floor, pulling weeds from his pathetic little garden. She ate every meal he put in front of her, slowly, deliberately, as if memorizing the taste of food that wasn't a threat. The emptiness in her eyes was still there, but now sometimes he'd see a flicker of something else behind it, a spark of awareness, a ghost of a thought. On the third night, she was sitting by the fire, mending one of his shirts with a needle and thread. Her stitches were small and perfect. He was cleaning his rifle, the lamplight glinting off the oiled steel. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was comfortable. She looked up from her sewing, her eyes catching the light. It was the first time she'd looked directly at him without flinching. "Why didn't you touch me?" she asked. Her voice was still quiet, but the tremor was gone. It was a genuine question, an impossible one. Thomas stopped his work. He set the rifle down carefully. He met her gaze and held it. He thought of all the horrors her question implied, of the world that had taught her that a man's touch was a thing to be feared, a price to be paid. "Because no one should have," he said, his voice low and steady. He saw her lip tremble, just for a second. She didn't cry. He got the feeling she had forgotten how, but something in her seemed to settle. An invisible weight lifted from her shoulders. She nodded once, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, and went back to her sewing. That single exchange changed everything. It was a bridge built across a canyon of pain. She wasn't his prisoner. She wasn't his burden. She was Ida, and he was Thomas. And for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't just existing. He was protecting someone. The old instincts, the ones he'd tried to bury, were stirring. He should have been worried. He should have known that feeling would lead to nothing but blood and trouble. The next morning, he knew they were running out of time. Their supplies were low, and his solitude couldn't feed them forever. He had to go to town. "I'm riding to Abiquiu," he told her as he saddled his horse. "Need flour and coffee. You stay here. Bolt the door. Don't open it for anyone." She just stared at him, her face pale. The thought of being left alone, even behind a bolted door, seemed to terrify her more than anything. Before he could argue, she was pulling on a pair of old boots she'd found in the barn and walking toward the second horse. She wasn't asking for permission. A part of him, the old marshal, screamed that it was a mistake. Taking her back there was like walking a lamb into a wolf den. But looking at the raw determination in her eyes, he knew leaving her behind would be crueler. "Stay close," he growled. And she did. The town of Abiquiu baked in the midday sun. It was a dusty collection of clapboard buildings, a place where secrets were currency and strangers were trouble. As they rode down the main street, Thomas felt a dozen pairs of eyes on them. People stopped talking. Porch sitters suddenly got very interested in the dust on their boots. They knew. Somehow, they already knew. He kept his face a mask of indifference, dismounting in front of the general store. Ada slid off her horse and stuck to his back like a shadow. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sawdust and suspicion. The storekeeper, a weaselly man named Peterson, couldn't meet his eyes. Thomas bought his supplies, paid in cash, and didn't waste a word. But the moment they stepped back outside onto the sun-bleached porch, a voice cut through the silence. A voice thick with whiskey and menace. "Well, I'll be damned. Look what the cat dragged back." Thomas turned slowly. Leaning against a support post was a big man with a red, puffy face and a cruel smile. Silas Blackwood. His clothes were expensive but stained, and he reeked of stale liquor. Ada went rigid behind Thomas, a small, terrified sound escaping her lips. Silas pushed himself off the post and sauntered toward them, his eyes fixed on Ada. "Lost your way, little bird? Flew right out of your cage before we were done with our business." Thomas stepped slightly, putting himself squarely between Silas and Ada. "She's got no business with you." Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Oh, she didn't tell you. Me and her, we had ourselves a deal, a private arrangement. She just got a little confused. Ran off before her debt was paid." The town was watching. No one moved. No one spoke. They were all afraid, not of Silas, of who he was. "Whatever deal you think you had," Thomas said, his voice dangerously low, "it's over." Silas's smile widened. It didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. "That's where you're wrong, old man. You see, this ain't just about me. My brother, Judge Gideon Blackwood, he takes contracts very seriously, and he runs this county, every sheriff, every rancher, every goddamn rock and lizard. So you see, you ain't just interfering with me." He poked a fat finger into Thomas's chest. "You're interfering with the law." The word judge hung in the air like a death sentence. Judge Gideon Blackwood wasn't just the law. He was a legend, a man who had tamed the territory with an iron fist and a hangman's rope. He was seen as a pillar of civilization. But Thomas knew men like that. He knew the kind of rot that could hide behind a fancy title and a powerful name. Ada was trembling uncontrollably behind him. He could feel her fear, a cold wave washing over him. And that's when he made a choice. The same kind of choice he'd made his whole life. The kind that always ended in gunfire. He didn't say a word. He simply looked down at Silas's finger on his chest, then back up at his smug face. And he hit him. It wasn't a brawl. It was a single, precise, devastating punch. The kind of punch that carries 10 years of buried rage behind it. Silas Blackwood's feet left the porch. He flew backward and landed in the dusty street with a sickening thud. Silence. The entire town held its breath. Silas lay in the dirt, spitting a mouthful of blood and broken teeth. He started to laugh, a gurgling, insane sound. "You're a dead man," he shrieked, his voice bubbling with blood. "A dead man! My brother will hang your skin from the courthouse flagpole." Thomas didn't even look at him. He turned to Ada, grabbed the reins of their horses, and helped her mount. His face was like granite. As they rode out of town, every eye followed them. They weren't just riding away from a drunken bully. They were riding away from the gallows. That night back at the cabin, the comfortable silence was gone. It had been replaced by a humming electric tension. The world had found them, and it was coming. "It's coming, isn't it?" Ada whispered, staring into the fire. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't hold her coffee cup. Thomas stood by the window, peering out into the impenetrable darkness. He didn't turn around. "Yeah," he said, his voice flat. "It's coming. But Ada knew something he didn't. She knew why the judge wanted her back so desperately. It wasn't about a broken deal with his drunken brother. It was about what she had seen, what she had found, what she had taken. Hidden in the lining of the old boots she was wearing was a small, folded piece of paper. It looked like nothing, just a list of names and numbers. But it was a ledger, the judge's private ledger. And it was proof of a conspiracy so vast and so evil, it would make what happened to her look like child's play. It was the evidence that could not only hang Judge Gideon Blackwood, but dismantle his entire empire. She was no longer just a victim. She was the only witness. And Thomas wasn't just her protector. He was now an accomplice to the most dangerous man in the territory. They didn't wait for morning. They didn't even wait for the moon to rise. As soon as the last light had faded from the sky, Thomas started moving with a grim, urgent purpose. He packed saddlebags with jerky, ammunition, and a small medical kit. He filled 2 canteens from the well. He wasn't just packing for a trip. He was packing for a war. Ada worked alongside him in silence. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. The answer was anywhere but here. She moved with a newfound resolve, her earlier trembling replaced by a focused intensity. She knew what was at stake. Thomas took one last look around the small cabin. It was the only home he'd known for years, a shell he'd built around his grief. Without a second thought, he left it all behind. He didn't burn it. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction or the smoke signal. He wanted them to arrive and find nothing but ghosts. They rode north into the jagged, unforgiving maw of the mountains. The trails were steep, the nights were cold, and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. But it was better than waiting in a cage for the hunters to arrive. For 2 days they pushed relentlessly, stopping only for brief rest to let the horses drink and graze. Thomas navigated the treacherous terrain with an unnerving expertise. He moved not like a rancher, but like a man who knew how to disappear. He chose paths that left little trace, doubling back on their trail, using rocky ground where hoofprints wouldn't hold. Ada, to his surprise, was no burden. She was tough, resilient. The hell she had endured had burned away anything soft or weak. She rode without complaint, her eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines behind them. On the 3rd morning, Thomas found the tracks. He'd led them through a dry creek bed, a place where the gravel would mask their passage. But as they emerged, he dismounted and knelt, his fingers tracing a faint impression in the dirt. It was a horseshoe print, but it wasn't from their horses. This one was fresh, too clean, too professional. And there was another set slightly to the right. 2 of them, he said, his voice a low growl. They're good. They're keeping their distance. Ada looked back the way they came, her face a pale mask. How? The judge wouldn't send his usual thugs up here, Thomas explained, his eyes narrowed. He'd hire men who know the mountains, trackers. They were being stalked, not by a posse, but by predators. The knowledge changed the dynamic of their flight. It was no longer a race, it was a hunt, and they were the prey. Thomas's entire demeanor shifted. The quiet rancher was gone. In his place was the man he used to be, U.S. Marshal Graves, cold, calculating, and utterly lethal. He pushed them harder into even more difficult terrain. He started thinking in terms of traps and ambushes. He wasn't just running anymore. He was choosing the ground. That night they made a cold camp in a dense thicket of pines, with no fire to give away their position. As they chewed on dry jerky, Ada finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper in the dark. It's not just about me, is it? Thomas looked at her. What do you mean? Silas, the deal. That was a lie to cover something else. It wasn't a question. Thomas waited. He knew she was holding something back, the final piece of the puzzle. She took a deep breath. I wasn't there for Silas. I was a housemaid for the judge. In his big house in Santa Fe, he'd bring girls there, young ones from all over. She faltered, the memory threatening to overwhelm her. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was what he was doing to everyone else. She reached into her boot and pulled out the folded, sweat-stained piece of paper. She handed it to him in the dark. He's stealing the whole territory, Thomas. He has a forger creating false deeds, land grants. He finds ranchers with deep roots but unclear paperwork, and he ruins them. Forecloses on them, sends men like Silas to run them off. That list, those are the names of his victims, and the payments he made to the forger. I found it in his study. I was trying to get away when Silas caught me. Thomas stared at the paper in his hand. It felt heavier than a brick of gold. This wasn't just about saving a girl. This was about saving dozens of families from a tyrant hiding behind a badge of honor. The fight had just gotten 100 times bigger, and 100 times more impossible. He won't stop until he gets this back, Ida whispered, and until I'm dead. Suddenly a twig snapped in the darkness, not far off. Instantly, Thomas grabbed his rifle, pulling Ida down behind a fallen log. His heart hammered in his chest. They weren't just being followed. The hunters had found them. He put a finger to his lips, his eyes straining to pierce the inky blackness. Another sound, a soft footfall, then another. They were being surrounded. The trackers weren't just good. They were ghosts. A low whistle cut through the night from their left. An answering whistle came from their right. It was a signal. They were closing the net. There was no escape. They were pinned down in the dark, miles from anywhere, with two expert killers moving in for the final strike. Thomas looked at the ledger in his hand, then at Ida's terrified face. He had thought he was running from his past, but it seemed his past was the only thing that could save them now. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating blanket that swallowed sound. Thomas lay flat on the pine needles, rifle pressed to his shoulder, every muscle coiled tight. He could hear Ida's ragged breathing beside him. The hunters were out there, moving with an unnerving patience. They knew they had their prey trapped. They were just waiting for the perfect moment. Thomas knew he couldn't wait for them to make the first move. In a defensive position, you only die tired. He leaned close to Ida, his lips brushing her ear. When I fire, he whispered, you run. Straight back the way we came. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just run. No, she breathed back, her voice shaking but firm. I'm not leaving you. That's an order, he hissed, the old authority of the marshal slipping out. Before she could argue, he saw it. A flicker of movement against the slightly less black silhouette of a distant tree. A man moving from one piece of cover to the next. He was a pro. Thomas didn't hesitate. He aimed, led the shadow by a foot, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle shot was a deafening explosion that tore the night apart. A man screamed, a sharp, ugly cry of pain and surprise that was cut short. The sound of a body hitting the ground followed. Go! Thomas yelled, shoving Ida. But she didn't run. Instead, as the second tracker opened fire, sending bullets splintering into the log they were hiding behind, Ida did something he never expected. She grabbed a rock, a big one, and scrambled away from him, deeper into the thicket. What are you doing? He roared over the gunfire. She didn't answer. A moment later, a loud crash echoed from about 50 yards to his left. She had thrown the rock, creating a diversion. The second tracker, thinking Thomas was relocating, immediately shifted his fire in that direction. It was the opening Thomas needed. He burst from behind the log, running low and fast, not away from the gunfire, but toward it. He was a wraith in the moonlight that now filtered through the trees. He saw the muzzle flash from behind a rocky outcropping. 3 shots, all aimed at the decoy sound Ida had made. The tracker was good, but he had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated the girl. Thomas was on him in seconds. The tracker turned, a rifle in his hands, his face a mask of shock. He wasn't expecting a direct assault. Thomas didn't give him time to aim. He crashed into the man, driving his shoulder hard into his chest. The rifle flew from the tracker's grasp. They rolled on the ground, a desperate, grunting struggle in the dark. The tracker was younger, stronger, but Thomas fought with a cold, brutal efficiency. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to end it. He got a hand on the man's throat, squeezing with all his strength. The tracker clawed at his face, his eyes wide with panic. Then a shape emerged from the trees. It was Ida, holding a thick, heavy branch like a club. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She brought it down with a sickening crack against the back of the tracker's head. The man went limp. Silence descended again, broken only by their heavy, gasping breaths. Thomas rolled off the unconscious man, staring at Ida in the dim light. She stood over the body, the branch still in her hands, her chest heaving. The terrified girl he had found under the juniper tree was gone. In her place stood someone else, a survivor. "I told you," she panted, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm not leaving you." Thomas quickly bound the tracker with his own rope. He checked the first man he'd shot. The shot had been true, a clean kill. One down, one to go. He dragged the captive behind the rocks. The man was stirring, groaning. Thomas put the cold barrel of his pistol against the man's temple. "Who sent you?" The tracker, a hard-faced man with a scar down his cheek, spat a mouthful of dirt. "Go to hell!" "I've been," Thomas said, his voice flat and cold. "Who sent you? Judge Blackwood?" The man just glared at him with hate-filled eyes. "All right," Thomas said, standing up. "Ida, we're leaving." The tracker's eyes widened in confusion. You're just leaving me here? Tied up?" "Yep," Thomas said, not looking back. "It'll take you a day to chew through those ropes. By then, we'll be long gone." He paused. "Hope a mountain lion doesn't find you first. They like to eat the soft parts while you're still breathing." A flicker of fear finally broke through the tracker's tough exterior. "Wait," he croaked. Thomas stopped, turning slowly. "The judge," the man gasped. "It was the judge. He wants the girl and the paper. He said to make it look like an accident. No witnesses." He licked his dry lips. "But it ain't just us. He sent for another man, a specialist. Said he was the best. Name of Kane. Jedediah Kane. He's supposed to meet us at the old mission by Three Rivers tomorrow." Jedediah Kane. The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. He felt the blood drain from his face. Ada saw his reaction, a look of pure shock and something else. Recognition. "Thomas, who is Jedediah Kane?" she asked. Thomas stared into the darkness, but he was seeing a ghost from 20 years ago. A bloody shootout in a dusty Texas town. A young marshal, cocky and fast. And a bounty hunter, a man who could track a whisper through a hurricane. A man as ruthless and deadly as a rattlesnake. A man Thomas had put a bullet in, but who had managed to slip away, leaving a trail of bodies behind him. A man who had sworn he'd repay Thomas one day. "He's not just a tracker," Thomas said, his voice a grim whisper. "He's the man who taught me everything I know about hunting men." He looked at Ida, the reality of their situation crashing down on him. "And he's never forgiven me for being better at it." They weren't just being hunted by the law or by hired guns. They were being hunted by Thomas's own past. By a ghost with a gun and a 20-year-old grudge. And he knew exactly how Thomas thought, how he moved, how he would try to escape. They had just survived the hunters, but the real monster was still on his way, and he was coming for blood. The name Jedediah Kane changed the very air they breathed. It was no longer a race against faceless trackers. It was a personal vendetta closing in on them. Thomas knew Kane's methods. Kane was relentless, brilliant, and patient. He would not make mistakes. He would not be diverted by simple tricks. He would come at them like the slow, inevitable creep of winter. Thomas made a decision. Running was no longer an option. Kane would anticipate every move, every trail they took. To run was to let Kane choose the battlefield. Thomas had to choose it himself. "The old San Miguel mission," Thomas said, his mind racing. "It's 3 days' ride from here. It's in ruins, but the walls are stone. It's defensible." "You want to go towards him?" Etta asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "We don't have a choice," Thomas replied, his eyes hard. "If we run, he'll pick us off in the open. But if we can get there first, fortify our position, we might have a chance. We turn the tables. We stop being the prey. We become the trap." It was a desperate, almost suicidal plan, but it was the only plan they had. They left the bound tracker to his fate and rode without stopping, pushing the horses and themselves to the brink of exhaustion. Thomas was a man possessed. He navigated by starlight, his senses on a razor's edge. He saw Kane's hand in every overturned rock, in every bird that flew up startled from a thicket. He was seeing the ghost of his own training coming back to haunt him. During the ride, Ida saw the toll it was taking on him. The iron mask of the marshal was cracking, revealing the weary man beneath. She took it upon herself to watch their back trail while he focused on the path ahead. She learned to read the signs, to listen to the language of the wilderness. She was no longer just a passenger in this fight. She was a soldier. They reached the ruins of the San Miguel mission at dusk on the second day. It stood on a low mesa, a skeleton of a church against a blood-red sky. The adobe walls were crumbling, the roof was gone, but it offered cover and a clear field of fire in every direction. They were exhausted, hungry, and down to their last few rounds of ammunition. They spent the next few hours preparing for a siege. They barricaded the weak points in the walls with fallen stones and debris. Thomas scouted the area, identifying the most likely approaches. He positioned them in the remains of the bell tower, the highest point, which offered the best vantage point, but also made them the most obvious target. As darkness fell, a chilling quiet descended. The wind moaned through the empty window arches like a choir of ghosts. "He's here," Thomas said softly, not needing to see him. "He's watching. He's learning the layout. He won't attack at night. That's not his style. He'll wait for dawn. He likes to look his enemy in the eye." They sat in the dark, back to back, rifle and pistol ready. Sleep was an impossible luxury. They talked in low whispers, not about the fight to come, but about the lives they had lived before this nightmare began. Ida spoke of her family, simple farmers who had died of fever, leaving her alone. Thomas, for the first time, spoke of his wife, Sarah. He spoke of her smile, the way she'd handled the horses, and the day he lost her to a stray bullet from a bank robber's gun. The day he took off his badge for good. In the ruins of a forgotten church, under a canopy of cold stars, two broken people shared their scars. They found a strange comfort in their shared damage. "Thomas," Ida whispered as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, "if we don't make it—" "We'll make it," he said with a conviction he didn't feel. "But if we don't," she insisted, "I want you to know. You're the first man who ever treated me like I was a person, not a thing. You saved me, not from them, from the nothing. Thank you." A lump formed in Thomas's throat. Before he could answer, a voice echoed across the mesa. A calm, conversational voice that chilled him to the bone. "Thomas Graves, it's been a long time. You've led me on a merry chase, but you always did like to hide in broken down places." Jedediah Kane. He was out there somewhere in the rocks below. "I have a proposition for you, Thomas," the voice called out again. "Send out the girl in the paper. I have no quarrel with you. My contract is with her. You walk away. You get to live out your miserable life in whatever hole you crawled out of. It's a better deal than you deserve." Thomas raised his rifle, scanning the landscape. He saw nothing. Kane was a master of concealment. "You know I can't do that, Jedediah," Thomas yelled back, his voice hoarse. A dry chuckle was the only reply. "I thought you might say that. Pity. I always liked you, Thomas. You were the only one who ever gave me a real challenge." There was a pause. This time, though, the challenge ends. The judge is a patient man, but his patience has a price, and he's authorized me to pay it in full. Suddenly, a rifle shot cracked from a position Thomas hadn't even considered. It came from their flank, from a pile of rocks he'd dismissed as too exposed. The bullet ricocheted off the stone wall, just inches from his head, spraying his face with dust and rock chips. Kane wasn't alone. The judge hadn't just sent his best tracker. He'd sent a posse. The other trackers, the local thugs, maybe even the corrupt sheriff himself. They weren't just facing a ghost from the past. They were surrounded by the full weight of Judge Blackwood's power. The first shot was followed by a volley. Bullets slammed into the adobe walls from 3 different directions. The ruins offered cover, but not enough. They were pinned down, outnumbered, and outgunned. Thomas returned fire, but it was sporadic, aimed at muzzle flashes he could barely see. He was just wasting precious ammunition. Ida was huddled low, reloading his spare pistol, her face grim and set. The suicidal plan had failed. It wasn't a trap for Kane. It was their tomb. As the sun climbed higher, baking the ruins in a merciless heat, Thomas knew they couldn't last an hour. Kane would just sit back, let his men wear them down, and then walk in to finish the job himself. He looked at Ida. Her eyes were filled with fear, but also with a fiery defiance. She hadn't survived this long to die in the dust. And that's when she pointed, not at the men shooting at them, but at the ground inside the ruins, at the floor of the old church. "Thomas," she said, her voice tight with a desperate idea. "The priests, they always built cellars, for the wine, for emergencies." It was a long shot, a wild hope, but it was the only one they had. While the bullets flew, they began desperately searching, pulling at loose flagstones, looking for any sign of a hidden entrance. It was Ida who found it, a heavy iron ring set into a stone slab, almost completely obscured by dirt and weeds. Together they heaved the stone aside, revealing a black, gaping hole and a set of steep, crumbling stairs leading down into the earth. The air that rose from it was cool and musty, the smell of forgotten centuries. It could be a sanctuary, or it could be a grave. With gunfire still echoing above, they descended into the darkness, pulling the heavy stone slab back into place over their heads, plunging their world into absolute blackness. They were alive, but they had just buried themselves. The darkness in the cellar was total, a physical presence that pressed in on them from all sides. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Above them, they could hear the muffled sounds of gunfire and the shouts of Kane's men as they realized their targets had vanished. Thomas fumbled in his pack and produced a match. He struck it against the stone wall, the tiny flare of light pushing back the oppressive gloom. They were in a small, vaulted chamber, not much bigger than a closet. The walls were lined with empty wine racks, covered in cobwebs. The match burned down, stinging his fingers. He lit a second one. "This won't last long," he said. "They'll find the entrance eventually. They'll either wait us out or come in after us." "So what do we do?" Ida whispered, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the confined space. "We find another way out," Thomas said, using the flickering matchlight to scan the walls. He was looking for another tunnel, another passage. Missions like this, especially those in hostile territory, often had escape routes. As the second match died, his fingers brushed against something on the far wall. Not stone, wood, a door. He felt for a latch, his heart pounding. He found a simple iron handle. It was stiff, rusted, but when he put his shoulder into it, it groaned open with the sound of tearing wood. He lit his third and final match. The light revealed a narrow, low-ceilinged tunnel, just wide enough for one person to crawl through. It was their only hope. "Stay behind me," he said, and plunged into the darkness of the tunnel. They crawled on their hands and knees through the suffocating blackness. The air grew stale, and the tunnel seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Ida clutched the back of his shirt, her presence a small comfort in the terrifying dark. After what felt like hours, Thomas felt a change in the air, a slight draft. He pushed forward, and his hands suddenly met empty space. The tunnel ended. He cautiously peered out. They were in a small cave at the base of the mesa, the entrance concealed by a thick curtain of overgrown vines. They had made it. They were out. But their relief was short-lived. From their hidden vantage point, they could see the mission above. Kane's men were swarming the ruins, and they could see something else. A rider approaching from the east, a man on a magnificent black horse, sitting tall and straight in the saddle. Even from a distance, he projected an aura of absolute power. Judge Gideon Blackwood. He had come to oversee the execution himself. Thomas and Ida watched as the judge dismounted and conferred with Jedediah Kane. They couldn't hear the words, but the gestures were clear. Kane pointed to the cellar entrance. The judge nodded, his face a cold mask of impatience. He wanted this over. They had escaped the siege, but they were still trapped. They were on foot, with no supplies, and the full force of the judge's private army was just a few hundred yards away. "We have to get the ledger out," Ida said, her voice steely. "It's not enough for us to survive. He has to be stopped." She was right. This was never just about them. It was about the dozens of families on that list. It was about justice. "The nearest town that isn't in Blackwood's pocket is Santa Fe," Thomas said, thinking aloud. "It's 100 miles from here. We'd never make it on foot." "Then we don't go on foot," Etta said, a daring, desperate glint in her eye. She was looking at the horses tethered near the mission, specifically at the judge's magnificent black stallion. It was insane. an act of such suicidal audacity that no one would ever see it coming. They'll be watching the roads, the trails, Thomas argued, though he could already feel the pull of her mad logic. We won't take the roads, she said. We'll go through the Badlands, where no one would dare to follow. Before he could protest further, they saw Kane's men gathering around the cellar entrance. They were preparing to go in. This was their only chance, the distraction they needed. All right, Thomas breathed, his mind made up. But we do it my way. He laid out the plan in a few quick, whispered sentences. It was a plan with 1,000 ways to fail and only one way to succeed. It relied on surprise, speed, and pure, unadulterated nerve. They waited until most of the men had descended into the cellar. Only 2 guards were left with the horses. The judge himself stood apart, staring at the cellar, waiting for the news of their death. Now, Thomas whispered. They broke from the cover of the vines, running low and fast across the open ground. They used the rocky terrain as cover, moving with a synchronized grace born of shared desperation. They were halfway to the horses before one of the guards spotted them. A shout of alarm went up. The guard raised his rifle. Thomas was faster. The pistol shot was a single, sharp crack. The guard crumpled. The second guard turned, his eyes wide with shock, and Ida, who had picked up a heavy rock, threw it with all her might. It struck him in the head, and he went down. The judge whirled around, his face a picture of disbelief. For a moment he was paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. The ghosts he had come to bury were stealing his horse. Thomas reached the stallion first, slicing through the reins with his knife. He vaulted into the saddle. Ida was right behind him, scrambling up behind him with a nimbleness he wouldn't have thought possible. Jedediah Kane emerged from the cellar just in time to see them. He raised his rifle, his face contorted with rage. He fired. The bullet whizzed past Thomas's ear. Go! Etta screamed. Thomas dug his heels into the stallion's flanks. The powerful horse leaped forward, galloping away from the mission with incredible speed. More shots rang out behind them, but they were already a moving target, a blur of motion against the desolate landscape. They rode like the wind, leaving the mission and their would-be executioners in a cloud of dust. They had done the impossible. They had escaped. They had the judge's prize horse, and tucked safely in Ida's shirt was the ledger that could bring his entire empire crashing down. But as they crested the first ridge, Thomas looked back. He saw Kane standing alone watching them. Kane wasn't shooting anymore. He was just standing there. And Thomas knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this wasn't over. For a man like Jedediah Kane, this wasn't a failure. It was just an insult, and he would cross hell itself to answer it. The race to Santa Fe had begun. The Badlands were a brutal, alien landscape. Jagged rock formations clawed at the sky, and the ground was a maze of deep canyons and treacherous ravines. It was a place where water was a memory and survival was measured in hours. But it was also a place that offered cover, a place where they could lose their pursuers. They pushed the judge's stallion to its limits, the magnificent animal proving its worth, navigating the broken terrain with an uncanny sureness of foot. For a full day, they rode with only the briefest of stops, driven by the certainty that Kane was behind them. Thomas knew his old mentor. Kane would not be slowed by the terrain, he would be one with it. By the second day, thirst had become a constant, tormenting presence. Their canteens were long empty, their lips were cracked, and their throats felt like they were lined with sand. The horse was beginning to falter. "We have to find water," Ida said, her voice a dry rasp, "or none of us will make it." Thomas scanned the horizon. There was nothing but sun-baked rock and shimmering heat waves. He felt a wave of despair, a rare and unwelcome visitor. He had led them into a death trap. They had escaped a firefight only to die of thirst. It was Ida who saved them. Her eyes, sharper and more accustomed to the subtle signs of the land, spotted it. A patch of vibrant green, almost hidden in the shadow of a deep canyon. Cottonwood trees. "Where there are cottonwood," she whispered, "there's water." They guided the weary horse down a steep, winding path into the canyon. And there it was, a small, hidden spring, bubbling up from the rocks into a clear, cool pool. It was a miracle. They drank deeply, letting the horse drink its fill. They rested in the shade, the first moment of real peace they'd had in days. As Thomas refilled their canteens, he noticed something carved into the rock face near the spring. It was a series of symbols, not native markings. Something else. "What is it?" Ida asked, coming to stand beside him. "I'm not sure," Thomas said, tracing the strange symbols with his finger. "Looks like a code, or a map." Suddenly, Ida gasped. She pointed to one of the symbols, a stylized bird with a broken wing. Then she pulled out the judge's ledger. She flipped to the last page. There in the corner was the exact same symbol, drawn in ink. "It's the forger's mark," she breathed. "The man who made the fake deeds for the judge. He must have used this place as a hideout." They looked around the small, hidden oasis. It wasn't just a watering hole. It was a secret workshop. Tucked into a small cave behind the spring, they found it. A small portable printing press, engraving tools, blank sheets of paper identical to the ones used for official land grants. And most importantly, a dozen of the judge's forged deeds, some half-finished, others bearing the names of ranchers who hadn't even been targeted yet. They had stumbled upon the very heart of Blackwood's criminal enterprise. The ledger was a list of his crimes. This cave was a confession in the steel and paper. "This is it," Thomas said, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "This is more than enough. This is everything." They packed as much of the evidence as they could carry into their saddlebags. They now had an arsenal not of bullets, but of truth. An arsenal that could not only expose the judge, but could also return the stolen land to its rightful owners. Their hope, however, was shattered by the sharp crack of a rifle from the canyon rim above. A bullet slammed into the rock just above their head. They were pinned down. "So this is where the little rats have been hiding," a familiar, sneering voice echoed down the canyon. It wasn't Kane. It was Silas Blackwood. He must have circled around, guessing they'd head for the only water source for 50 miles. And he wasn't alone. Thomas could see at least 4 other men with him on the rim. "Give it up, Graves!" Silas yelled, his voice slurring with drink and triumph. "The judge sent us to clean up the mess. Throw down the girl and the papers, and I might let you die quick." They were trapped at the bottom of the canyon with only one way out, and Silas's men held the high ground. It was the mission all over again, but worse. This time there was no cellar to hide in. Just as Thomas was raising his pistol to return fire, another rifle shot rang out. But this one didn't come from the canyon rim. It came from behind Silas and his men. One of Silas's thugs cried out and fell from the ridge, tumbling down the rocky slope. Everyone froze. Silas and his men whirled around in confusion, searching for the source of the shot. A lone figure stepped into view on the far side of the canyon rim. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in dusty leathers. Jedediah Kane. "What the hell, Kane?" Silas screamed. "You're shooting at us." "My contract was to retrieve the girl and the paper, Blackwood." Kane's calm voice echoed across the canyon. "The judge said, no witnesses." He never specified which ones. Another shot. Another of Silas's men went down. A chaotic firefight erupted on the canyon rim. Silas and his 2 remaining men against the deadly precision of Jedediah Kane. It was a battle between thugs and a master. "What is he doing?" Ida whispered in horrified confusion. "He's a professional," Thomas said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "He doesn't like loose ends, and he doesn't like loudmouth drunks like Silas. He's honoring his contract his way. He'll eliminate the competition, then come for us." Kane was a monster, but he had a code. A twisted, bloody code of his own. And right now that code was their only chance. As the gunfight raged above, Thomas grabbed Ida's arm. "This is it. While they're busy with each other, we have to climb." He pointed to a narrow, treacherous-looking chimney in the rock face, a vertical crack barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It was their only path out that wasn't covered by the guns above. The climb was a nightmare. The rock was loose, the handholds were tiny. They scrabbled for purchase, dust and pebbles raining down on them. Below, the gunfight came to its inevitable conclusion. The last of Silas's men fell, and a final, choked-off scream told them that Silas Blackwood had met his end. Silence. They were halfway up the rock face, completely exposed. Thomas looked up, and his heart stopped. Standing at the top of the chimney, silhouetted against the bright blue sky, was Jedediah Kane. He was looking down at them, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He wasn't aiming. He was just watching them climb toward him. A predator watching its prey exhaust itself. He had finished with Silas. Now it was their turn. "Well, Thomas," Kane said, his voice calm and conversational, as if they were meeting in a saloon, "it seems it's just you and me now. Just like old times." There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They were hanging on the side of a cliff, completely at his mercy. The long hunt was finally over. "It's always been just you and me, Jedediah," Thomas called up, his voice strained from the climb. He was trying to buy time, to think, but his mind was blank. He had his pistol, but Kane was too far, the angle impossible. Kane smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his weathered face. "I have to admit, you've made this interesting. The girl's got more spirit than I expected, but all good things must come to an end." He slowly started to raise his rifle. This was it, the end of the line. Thomas looked down at Ida, who was clinging to the rock just below him. Her face was streaked with dirt, but her eyes were locked on Kane, burning with a defiant fire. She wasn't afraid. She was angry. And then she did something that defied all logic. She started to climb again, faster, scrabbling up the rock face directly toward Kane. "Ida, no!" Thomas yelled. "He can't shoot me if I'm right under him." She shouted back, her voice echoing in the narrow chimney. It was a move of pure, insane desperation. Kane looked down, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second, surprised by her audacity. That tiny moment of hesitation was all Thomas needed. He wasn't trying to shoot Kane. He was trying to distract him. He pulled his pistol, aimed at the rock face just beside Kane's head, and fired. The bullet sparked off the stone, sending a shower of sharp fragments into Kane's face. Kane roared in pain and surprise, stumbling back, momentarily blinded. In that same instant, Ida reached the top. She didn't stop. She launched herself forward, not at Kane, but at his rifle. She grabbed the barrel with both hands and pulled, using her entire body weight to wrench it from his grasp. The rifle clattered down the chimney, falling past Thomas and into the canyon below. Kane, his eyes streaming from the rock dust, lashed out blindly, backhanding Ida across the face. She fell to the ground, stunned. Thomas hauled himself over the ledge, his lungs burning. He was on his feet just as Kane cleared his eyes. The two men faced each other on the narrow canyon rim. The old marshal and the legendary bounty hunter. No guns, just two old wolves, ready for the final fight. "You should have stayed retired, Thomas," Kane snarled, wiping blood from a cut on his cheek. "You should have stayed a ghost, Jedediah," Thomas replied, circling him slowly. They came together in a brutal flurry of motion. Kane was faster, but Thomas was stronger, fueled by a righteous fury he hadn't felt in years. They traded blows, grunting with the effort. It wasn't a skillful fight. It was a desperate, ugly brawl on the edge of a cliff. Kane got the upper hand, driving Thomas back toward the edge. Thomas's heel slipped on the loose gravel. He was falling. Kane lunged, his hands reaching for Thomas's throat, a triumphant snarl on his face. Suddenly, a shape rose up behind Kane. It was Ida. In her hand was the heavy pistol she had picked up from one of Silas's dead men. She didn't fire. She swung it like a club, with every ounce of her strength, bringing the steel butt of the gun down on the back of Jedediah Kane's head. There was a sickening thud. Kane's eyes went wide, the triumph replaced by a look of utter disbelief. He swayed on his feet for a moment, then without a sound, he pitched forward and fell from the cliff, disappearing into the canyon below. A profound silence fell over the Badlands. Thomas lay on the ground, gasping for breath. Ida stood over him, the heavy pistol still in her trembling hand. They looked at each other, two survivors covered in dust and blood, on a lonely canyon rim in the middle of nowhere. They had won. They had survived. They had the evidence. But their enemy was still alive. And he was sitting in the seat of power in Santa Fe, a man who believed himself to be untouchable. The final part of their journey was about to begin. Not a race for survival, but a march for justice. And they both knew it would be the most dangerous part of all. They arrived in Santa Fe 2 days later, not as fugitives, but as ghosts returning to haunt the living. They were haggard, bruised, and wearing the dirt of the Badlands like a second skin, but in their eyes was a hard-won fire. They didn't go to the local sheriff. Thomas knew the judge's influence stretched far and wide. Instead, they went straight to the one place the judge's power might not hold sway, the office of the territorial governor. Getting an audience was nearly impossible. They were dismissed as vagrants, crazed prospectors from the desert, but Thomas still carried the weight of his old life. He used his former title, U.S. Marshal, a name that still commanded respect, and it was enough to get them past the first set of guards. For the rest, he used the sheer, unyielding force of his will. They found themselves in a lavish office, standing before Governor Wallace, a man with a stern face and weary eyes, a man who had heard 1,000 wild stories. "This had better be important, Marshal Graves," the governor said, his tone making it clear he believed Thomas was no longer a marshal. "I have important matters to attend to." Thomas didn't speak. He simply took the satchel from Ida and emptied its contents onto the governor's polished mahogany desk. The forged deeds, the engraving plates from the forger's cave, and on top of it all, he placed the judge's blood-stained ledger. "Judge Gideon Blackwood is a thief and a murderer," Thomas said, his voice quiet but resonant with authority. "And this is his confession." The governor stared at the evidence, his skepticism slowly melting away as he began to read the names, the dates, the cold, hard numbers in the ledger. He looked at Ida, at the fading bruises on her face, and saw not a vagrant, but a witness. For an hour, Ida told her story. She spoke with a clear, steady voice, detailing everything she had seen, everything she had suffered. She laid bare the rot at the heart of Abiquiu County. When she was finished, the governor was silent for a long time. He looked out the window at the town square, where the courthouse, Judge Blackwood's courthouse, stood as a monument to a false justice. "The judge is a powerful man," the governor said finally. "He has friends, powerful friends. An accusation like this, it could tear the territory apart." "The truth doesn't care about politics," Thomas said. The governor looked him in the eye. "No," he said, a new resolve hardening his features. "It does not." What happened next happened fast. The governor, using his authority, summoned a detachment of U.S. Army soldiers from the local fort. Not territorial marshals who could be in the judge's pocket, but federal troops who answered only to him. They marched across the plaza to the courthouse. Judge Gideon Blackwood was in the middle of a trial, dispensing his own brand of twisted justice. He looked up, annoyed, as the governor and two armed soldiers entered his courtroom. "Governor," the judge said, his voice smooth as silk, though his eyes were cold with suspicion, "to what do I owe this unexpected interruption?" The governor walked to the center of the room. "Gideon Blackwood," he announced, his voice booming in the silent courtroom. "By the authority of the United States government, I am placing you under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and murder." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. The judge's face, for the first time, lost its composure. It twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "On what grounds?" he hissed. "You have no proof." "Oh, but we do," the governor replied. He gestured to the doorway, and Ida walked in. She was no longer the broken girl from under the juniper tree. She was dressed in a simple, clean dress. Her head was held high. She met the judge's murderous gaze without flinching. In her hands she held his ledger. The courtroom erupted. The judge, seeing his entire empire crumble before his eyes, did the last thing anyone expected. He pulled a small Derringer pistol from inside his robes and fired. Not at the governor, not at the soldiers, at Ida. Thomas, who had been standing just inside the door, moved faster than a man his age had any right to. He threw himself in front of Ida, a human shield. The bullet slammed into his shoulder, spinning him around. He grunted in pain but did not fall. Before the judge could fire again, the soldiers were on him, wresting the pistol from his hand and pinning him to the floor like the common criminal he was. The reign of Judge Gideon Blackwood was over. Weeks later, Thomas sat on the porch of a small new ranch house, his arm in a sling. The governor, as a gesture of gratitude, had used seized assets from the Blackwood estate to reward them. The stolen lands were being returned to their rightful owners. The territory was breathing clean air again. Ada came out and sat beside him, handing him a cup of coffee. The silence between them was easy, comfortable. The ghosts of their past were still there, but they were quieter now, fainter. "That girl under the tree," she said, looking out at the sunset. "The one who was filthy inside and out. I think she's finally gone." Thomas looked at her, at the strength in her eyes, the small, confident smile on her lips. "Then I'm proud to have buried her," he said, "and honored to know the woman who took her place." They had found in each other not a grand, sweeping romance, but something far more rare and durable, a shared peace. Two broken souls who together had somehow become whole again. They hadn't set out to be heroes. They had just done the next right thing, and then the next, until justice was served. Their story became a quiet legend in the territory, a reminder that even in the darkest of places, when the law is corrupt and evil wears a judge's robe, it sometimes just takes one good person to stand up and say, "No more." So let me ask you a question. When you see injustice, when you see someone broken and alone, do you turn away or do you step forward? The world doesn't always need a hero in a shining suit of armor. Sometimes all it needs is a quiet person with a good horse and a strong sense of what's right to make a stand. If this story stirred something in you, do us a favor and hit that like button. And if you believe that tales of courage and justice deserve to be told, then make sure you subscribe to the channel because we have a lot more stories coming your way. Thank you for listening.